This teacher is determined to help his students excel in his class this term. He wants to implement a teaching method that is sure to help the information his students are going to be learning to stick. Which of these two teaching methods will help his students ace his class? To review the material by repeating it multiple times? Or for him to get his students to try to remember what they have already learned? It turns out that getting his students to remember the learning material is a much more effective teaching method than is repeating the material. It is also much more effective than having students study their notes or the text by rereading them. Let me explain. Decades ago, cognitive psychologists brought to light an unusual finding. Did you know that giving your students a test actually helps them better learn what they are being tested on? Researchers call this phenomenon the testing effect, the observation that people will better learn something if they take a test on it than if they simply review what they are learning instead. So, how does the testing effect work? Well, it is believed that something referred to as retrieval practice is responsible. And what is retrieval practice? Basically, it is practice at retrieving something from memory. In other words, it is the act of trying to remember what has been learned. So, if you ask your students to try to remember something they have learned, they are engaging in retrieval practice. As simple as that. And while closing their eyes is not required, keeping their notes and textbooks closed is. It doesn't count as retrieval practice unless it comes from memory. You'll likely have to remind students of this. So, going back to the testing effect, what do your students' brains do when they try to answer a question on a test? They try to remember what they have learned, right? That is why the testing effect is sometimes referred to as retrieval practice, because students engage in retrieval practice when they take a test. Okay, but how can retrieval practice be a better learning method than reviewing? Well, retrieval practice works by strengthening neural pathways in the brain. Everything students think of and know involves a pathway of brain activation. The more a pathway is activated, the more easily it is triggered in the future. When students first learn something, they need to reactivate that neural pathway multiple times to increase the chances that they will be able to access it in the future when they need it. Retrieval practice is kind of like a hiking trail. The first time someone treads new ground, that person is stomping through weeds and grasses. However, the more people who walk along that same path, the more established and easy to follow it will become. It is the same with the brain and the new things that are learned. And why doesn't rereading or reviewing do this for students? The problem with rereading is that it is a very different process from remembering. Rereading simply makes students better at reading what's in their notes or what's in the textbook chapter. In fact, it often gets students into trouble because they confuse the ease in which they can read the material with learning. They think they have learned the material when in fact they have just gotten really good at reading it. This also goes for material that teachers repeat in class. The fluency of a lecture can leave students feeling like they understand when in fact they don't. And even for the information students do understand, their brains are designed to wipe everything clean if they don't actually work at remembering the information. And if you think about it, it makes sense that if you want students to be able to remember something in the future, they need to actually practice the act of remembering it. You wouldn't expect students to get better at playing chess by reading the rules of the game over and over, would you? Another common misunderstanding among students and teachers alike is that the more information that can be stuffed into students' brains, the better they will learn it. In fact, it really is the opposite. Students should be practicing getting information out of their heads through retrieval practice. I really like how Robert Bjork, a retrieval practice researcher, puts it. We should input less and output more. So, hopefully, you are now sold on the importance of retrieval practice as a teaching and learning method. But how can you incorporate retrieval practice into your classroom? Let's take a look at 6 methods to try. Number 1, practice tests. We already talked about testing as a retrieval practice method. Practice quizzes work great, especially if you are able to allow retakes. Number 2, opening questions. At the beginning of class, ask students to recall material covered in a previous lesson or in a recently completed homework. You can do this orally by asking for volunteers to share, but doing this in writing has the added benefit that everyone engages in the retrieval practice. Also, as instructors, we know that reviews can be helpful. However, instructors often think that they have to do it. Instead, get your students to do the recalling. And again, remind students not to look through their notes or the textbook, as that defeats the purpose. Number 3, online retrieval checks. If you post materials online for students to read or watch, consider inserting retrieval type questions either throughout the material or at the end. And if your tech skills are too challenged to do this, simply create a separate assignment in your LMS or distribute a hard copy of the retrieval questions to your students to be completed after reviewing the material. Number 4, brain dumps. Midway or at the end of a lecture, ask students to pull out a piece of paper and their favorite writing utensil and to jot down everything they just learned. This is sometimes lovingly referred to as a brain dump. Number 5, main points, is a modified brain dump, where you just get students to try to recall the top 2 or 3 key points, or what seemed to be the most valuable information. And number 6, partner up. Students don't have to write down what they retrieve from memory. During class, have students turn to a neighbor and have an exchange with that person about what they have learned. Like what you have learned? For more information on retrieval practice and more ideas on how to do it, check out these resources.